Welcome to the American Australian Association's Immigration and Mortgage Update for Australian Expats. I'm Libby Swan, the Chief Operating Officer here at the American Australian Association, and I just wanted to give a special welcome to all of our members who have also joined us tonight. I'm delighted to be here with two wonderful and knowledgeable experts in their respective fields. Please welcome Chantal Markel. Chantal is the principal of Markel, a New York-based immigration law firm that represents organizations and individuals from all over the world. Tonight, she will be updating us on the importance of visa holders maintaining ties to their home country while on a non-immigrant visa, and the difference in home residency requirements for US visa types, along with the questions you submitted upon registration. We are also very excited to be working with one of our newest corporate members, Odin Mortgage. Odin Mortgage is the leading Australian mortgage brokerage for Australian expats and overseas residents across the globe. Martin Zhang is the co-founder, licensed mortgage broker, and MFAA credit advisor at Odin Mortgage, here to answer all your mortgage-related queries and provide information on how to best invest in a property while overseas. Let's get into it. Over to you, Chantal.
Thank you so much, Libby. Thank you. It's good to be back. Such a lovely, wonderful sunny day today, which is a big change from the rainy days that we've had. So I'm going to jump right into it because I know we have limited time and so much content to cover. So I'm going to share my screen. And so I just wanted to start with tonight, I'm going to be talking about what Libby had mentioned, home residency requirements under the different visa categories, and particularly to tie it into Martin's topic of mortgages in Australia. When is it beneficial and most beneficial to own or have a home in Australia or have a mortgage in Australia as your best evidence of home ties to Australia? And so why I thought it was a relevant topic to bring up at the moment is that there was an update to the Foreign Affairs Manual for E3s, whereby I think having a home in Australia could be beneficial. And that update relates to a section called 214B, and 214B relates to immigrant intent. So we're going to look at 214B. We're going to look at the comparison of what home ties are needed and residency requirements or residence abroad requirements are necessary depending on which visa class. That was really fun, actually, looking into all of those and making a comparison chart. We'll bring that up. We'll show that to you. Won't get into the weeds of it, but you'll have fun looking at it. The B2 applicant, people forget that maybe one day they might be a B2 applicant. So we're going to go through that and who could become a B2 visa applicant, and other evidence of home ties, and then a couple of just updates, immigration updates that are relevant and timely right now, that are relevant to having a home abroad, but also that just happened. And the DV lottery, which is coming up next week, people will be able to apply for it. And just how does having a home in Australia or a mortgage in Australia benefit you when you enter the DV lottery? So we've tied that all in together. Okay, great. So the update that I wanted to jump into was in the Foreign Affairs Manual. So what the Foreign Affairs Manual is the manual that is given to the immigration officers at the consulates abroad. So when you go to the consulate and you apply for your visa, that immigration officer has looked at guidelines on how they should adjudicate your visa. So on May 1st, a new section was added to the E3 visa, and specifically under the section that is related to home ties and to your intent to depart the United States. And that new section was what you see here. I'll just point to it with my cursor, is number C. And that's the language of 214B, which is an E-visa immigrant is presumed to be an immigrant until the applicant establishes to you that to the satisfaction that they are entitled to that non-immigrant status. And so that paragraph was not previously there. I'm going to show you the actual section so you can see it. And the reason why I wanted to go over this section is because this intent to depart section is what gives rise to the questions that I often receive from a lot of you that in the audience either applying for an E3. So often I'll get the question, I'm applying for an E3 and am I going to get denied for immigrant intent? I've already had 4 E3 visas. You know, do you think it's a risk applying for a new one? Or even on the first time, do you think it's a risk if I don't have home ties, if I don't have a home in Australia? Do I have to have, am I allowed to apply for a green card while I'm on an E3? That's another question that comes up a lot. And this particular section kind of deals with how an immigration officer will look at those things when you're applying for the visa. So what's really interesting is that it contradicts itself so much. But because of that, it ties in nicely into what Martin's topic is having a mortgage in Australia or obtaining a mortgage, buying property in Australia. Because at the end of the day, every time you are applying for a non-immigrant visa, even if for that visa category, which is similar to the E3 specifically, and E1s and E2s also say this, it will say, the E3s might say, you do not necessarily need to have a residence abroad in a foreign country, which you do not intend to abandon. But then it'll say, however, if you have an immigrant petition pending, so in other words, if you're pursuing a green card, you need to prove to us that you do have the intent to depart the United States at the end of your E3 status before you get that green card. So it kind of contradicts itself. And then that section C that they've added in there as well is that the E3 visa applicant is presumed to be an immigrant until they establish otherwise. And so the reason it's contradictory is because what USCIS and what Department of State consider to be the best evidence of non-immigrant intent and proving that you are not an intending immigrant is having real property in a foreign country. So I just thought it was very interesting and something worth bringing up. What some immigration attorneys have said is that with the insertion of this new paragraph, maybe immigration officers are going to be paying more attention to that section 214B, to immigrant intent, and asking more questions around it. We have not, since May, we're in September, we have not seen it become an issue at all, so I don't want to alarm anyone. But we have made our clients put in a little bit more documentation into their visa applications with respect to evidence of their home ties, so that it won't be an issue, even if those questions do start to arise. But again, we have not seen too many of those questions. So what is this 214B that this new section is saying to immigration officers? You need to pay special attention to 214B, even for E3s. So what it is if you were to get denied under 214B, it means you didn't meet 2 prongs. One, you weren't able to establish that you qualify for the elements of the visa. So maybe let's just say for an E3, maybe your visa your occupation's not a specialty occupation. So it means they could deny you under 214B. But the second prong is that you weren't able to overcome the presumption of immigrant intent, meaning that you weren't able to show that you intend to leave the US at the end of this visa. If it's for an E3, at the end of the 2 years, right? So there's 2 prongs. So what we've often seen is that a denial under 214B, often, when you're applying for a visa, typically you can show you qualify for the visa. So often the home ties will be sort of the catch-all part of 214B that they'll rely on. And often, sometimes it's not even home ties that they're worried about. It could be something else, but there's no basis of denial for whatever they're concerned about. So they'll just say, oh, home ties, and then they'll deny it under this. So this is why we want people to have strong evidence of home ties. So it would be a bit unusual for the immigration officer to be able to say, well, we're going to deny you under home ties when you've owned a property in Australia, let's say, because you've got such strong home ties. Okay, and just also Ls and H1Bs are exempt from the second prong of section 214B. So if you're in L status, L or H1B status, then the showing home ties is not important. Showing that you have non-immigrant intent is not important. But on that note, what I also want to go through, and I'm going to go through in this chart, is that people then think, oh, well, I can only be in an L or an H1B to pursue a green card. But that's actually not the case. You can actually be in all these other non-immigrant visa classes and still pursue a green card. But, and what you'll see from this chart, and I don't want you to get bogged down in this chart because there's a lot of content there. It's there, but I'm not going to go into the weeds of it. But what is important is that if you are pursuing a green card under one of these non-immigrant visa categories, but you're applying for a non-immigrant visa category that also has non-immigrant intent, that then having property abroad will be great because it will show the non-immigrant intent, even though you've got an immigrant petition filed for you, which is evidence that you might be looking to get a green card. So you're probably sitting there going, whoa, what does this mean? So, for example, I'll bring this into an E3 example. I get this question all the time. People say, but I can't apply for an E3 visa because the E3 visa, you have to have non-immigrant intent. So how can I pursue a green card and show that I have non-immigrant intent? Well, often the green card process is commenced by an employer petition or somebody else petitioning for you. And it's not until you file the I-485 part, the adjustment of status, or you go to the consulate if you're getting the green card by a consulate processing, that you're actually showing your intent that you want the green card. Because sometimes an employer might pursue a green card on your behalf, even if you don't necessarily want it, because they've just gone into the motions of it. So what's great is if you are in one of these statuses that you do need to show non-immigrant intent, but you're also pursuing a green card, if they question, well, we think if we see that you have this green card in motion, but now you're trying to apply for an E3, or you're trying to apply for an E1 or E2, or you're trying to apply for an O1, you can say, but look, I have this property abroad, so my intention's coming back. Right now, yes, there's this green card going on, but at the end of the term of this visa, right now, my intention is to go back. And having a property abroad really helps with that. So I've got here, what I did with this chart was a very interesting exercise, was there's under the different non-immigrant visa categories, there's a thing called there's a requirement, which is called maintaining a residence abroad, which you have no intention of abandoning. And there's some non-immigrant visa categories that require that you maintain a residence abroad with no intention of abandoning. And then there's others that say, well, that's not required, but I am saying, but it's still helpful because you might be pursuing a green card or something else where you need to show non-immigrant intent. And for this 214B thing where they're saying, well, we can just deny anyone that's applying for a non-immigrant visa if they can't establish that they aren't an intending immigrant, right? So here in green are the categories, a B1, B2, an F, a J1, an O2, so not O1, but O2, which are support staff to O1s, and their O3 spouses. So these categories are ones that specifically, in the regulations, specifically state you must have a residence abroad that you do not intend on abandoning, right? So what does a residence abroad that you don't intend on abandoning mean? I don't own property, that's it. Like, is this going to be used as it? They recognize that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to own property, but you just have to show that you are attached to a home that you call a residence. So for example, if you're a student, it could be that you have all of your maybe your driver's license and other, things related to your health growing up and everything that is attached to the family home, that your parents still live in this family home. If you're applying for B1, B2, that you could have a lease, a rental agreement. But the coup de grace, of course, with all of these is obviously either a deed or a mortgage, and bringing it back to the topic of the webinar. So what's interesting is that these other ones, E3 and E3D, E1, E2, O1. So H1B and L1, you just don't need it at all, right? But where these ones it's relevant is because here, can the beneficiary be an immigrant? Can you have a green card going in the background? And here it's yes. However, you must have the intent to depart at the end of your stay. Yes, however, you have to show your intent to depart. You know, yes, you can have a green card going. Actually, O1 specifically say you can have dual intent, but you're supposed to show that you're only intending to be there for the duration of the O1 activity. So in being able to establish that extra element, having a home abroad helps with that. So hopefully that's as clear as mud for everyone. Okay, so leading to the next slide here. So I thought what was interesting is that where home ties becomes really relevant, and especially if you own a property, it can be really amazing abroad, is if you are either applying for a B1, B2, or maybe you need to change into B1, B2 status while you're in the United States, because this is typically for visitors to the United States for business or pleasure. And it's the category that is most where immigrant intent and home ties is most attached to, right? This is the category when you're applying for this, really the only thing they're looking at is home ties. And are you coming to do an activity that is touristic or business related? But then they want to know you're going to leave. And so a lot of you will listen and go, well, that's not going to apply to me. I have an E3 visa. I have an L. I have an O. But actually, a lot of people in those statuses sometimes end up either switching to a B for a period of time, but when they're in the US, or they might need a B at some point in time. So I thought I'd go through what that is so that then if you're ever in one of these situations, you know, okay, there's a B available to me. And, oh, you know what? Having my mortgage and my property in Australia is going to be really great for this. So anyone who wants to enter the United States for more than the 90 days on a nester, you apply for a tourist visa, you want to come for 6 months, tour around, great. It could even be someone like that's been here, you've been here on an L1 for the longest time, you've given up your green card maybe because for tax reasons. I know a lot of our Australian American Association members have had green cards or are thinking of giving up their green cards at this point in time sometimes, but they know they want to come back for big chunks of time. They've got kids that want to go to college here. They've got there's reasons why they owned a property here, but they wanted to get rid of their green card for tax reasons, but want to be able to spend significant chunks of time here. After giving up their green card or their L or O, and then you would want to be able to apply for a B visa to then come back in. So in that instance, because you've had this green card or you've had these long stints in America, having a home abroad is really beneficial. If you've ever overstayed, this is an interesting one. If you've ever overstayed, and this will hopefully deter anyone from ever overstaying an ESTA for even a minute, but if you overstay an ESTA by that clock clicking over from midnight to the next day of your ESTA I-94 end date, then you will never be able to use ESTA ever again, and you would have to apply for a B. If you're coming in for frequent business trips, you might getting hassled at the border. You know, you're coming in too much. What are you doing? If you have a B, that can help with that. If you are, another good one to know is that if you're on an L or an E3 or an E2 or an O, and you're in a de facto relationship and you're not married, and you don't want to get married, but you want your de facto partner to be able to come over to the United States with you. You know, people are like, oh, well, I'm going to have to get married. Well, you don't have to get married because there is a B2 available to de facto partners. Doesn't allow them to work in the United States, but there is this option so that you don't have to get married if you don't want to. There's one for nannies. If you've had your nanny abroad, you definitely want to consult with an immigration lawyer if you want to look into that. And if you've ever been denied entry to the US or had a visa revoked, then you'll need a B visa to be able to come into the United States. Then the other time it's really relevant, change of status to B2, is say you're here on any of these visa classes, an E3, an L, and you lose your job or you quit your job. You quit your job and you want to stay here for a little bit. So right now you have 60 days in those visa classes between the end of your employment with your employer, with the visa you're on, and finding a new employer and being able to carry your visa over to that new employer. So 60 days is actually not that long to be able to, often, unless you already have this other job lined up, to find another job, get the visa paperwork ready and do it. So typically what we often see is that people will switch into B status for a period of time to buy time before their next visa status. And when you submit an application of change of status, to B2, you need to show you have really strong home times abroad, that you are going to go home. So that's where we would put in the evidence of a mortgage or home ownership into that application. That really strengthens that application. Okay, so I'm just going to gloss over this because I want to obviously give Martin time and I'm taking up a lot of time. But there's other evidence of ties abroad. The coup de grace is property, owning property, a mortgage. But if you don't own property and a mortgage, it's not the end of the world. You can show bank statements, credit card statements abroad. You have a business abroad, you have family abroad, your driver's license, maintaining your cell phone plan abroad. All these things are still relevant. So I don't want people to panic and feel like they absolutely have to buy a place abroad, but having a home is the coup de grace. Okay, and then same with E3s, very similar. If you have a home abroad or evidence of a mortgage, home, it's going to help, particularly with all of those, each E3 renewal and showing that you are not an intending immigrant. But if you don't have a home abroad, there are other things that you can show. So to the update, we were just talking about the change of status. Sometimes people will file a change of status to B if they've lost a job or they want to quit their job, but they don't want to leave the US. They want to find a different opportunity, but they just need time. Or you've ended your employment and you just want time to be a tourist here before going home to Australia. You would file a I-539 change of status. Other times when changes of status are filed are you might be an E3 and you get married and you want to be an E3D of your spouse now. There are multiple different types of 539 applications, but as announced at the end of last week, as of October 1, if you file an I-539, you no longer need to pay the biometric service fee, which was $85. So instead of being $455 now to file a change of status, it's only $370, which is great. The other thing that was difficult is if you were filing a change of status to B, you had to pay the biometric. This biometric, getting your fingerprints taken during a change of status was brought during the Trump administration. So it looks like they're now phasing that back out again. So historically, you never had to do fingerprints when you were changing status. Then they brought it in. And then now it looks like they're phasing it out because not only will you not have to pay the fee, but you won't have to go do a biometrics, which is something that's been a bit of a pain for people when they're changing status. Then you have to get the biometrics notice and you've got to go do it. Sometimes people are traveling, which is the whole point of changing to Bs because you want to travel. And then it's tough for them to attend that biometric notice because you have to attend at the location that you're told to attend. But anyway, it's good news because won't have to do biometrics and won't have to pay that fee. So it's a bit cheaper. And then lastly, the thing that I wanted to cover was DV Lottery is opening up next week. The link is not there on the site yet, so don't freak out when you go to the site and try and find it. They always put it up, pretty much in those days coming up. But what I wanted to talk about is, well, a couple of things. Number one is, people say, well, I can't enter the DV Lottery because I'm on an E3 or I'm on a J1 or I'm on an F1, and entering the DV Lottery means that I'm showing I've got immigrant intent, that I'm intending immigrant, and then I could jeopardize my E3 renewal or my visa, or even just a new E3, right? That's not the case. Our clients apply for the DV Lottery all the time. They often win. And even though here it will say, you can't have the intention of using it to adjust status in the US, if you do win and you happen to be in the US, you can adjust status in the US to get that green card. And we've done it many, 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 many times. I was about to say millions, but I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but at least hundreds of times, and always successfully. So where here the property is relevant is that, say you enter the green card lottery, but you don't get picked. And now you need to go to the consulate and apply for an E3. And they say, did you enter the green card lottery? Yes, but I'm not an intending immigrant here. I have a home in Australia that I'm coming back to. I was entering the green card lottery. It's a lottery. I didn't expect to win, but other friends were, applying. I love lotteries. And if I did win, I would use it for the same reason I'd use my E3, which is for 2 years to just work in the US without even having to get an employer to sponsor me. The other situation, which is a little bit more where having a property would be really beneficial, is what happened this year is people got selected for the green card lottery last year. They needed to adjust and get their green cards by September 30th of this year. And when you get selected in the green card lottery, there's no guarantee that you'll actually end up getting the green card because they over-select numbers. There's only 50,000 of them, and they select about 80,000. And so you get a rank number, and you can only get to it. They will only process your green card application when they get to your rank number. So what we saw for the very first time this year is not only did they not meet the high rank numbers in the 2000s, but people who were able to even apply where their rank number became current and they were able to submit all their paperwork and even get scheduled for an interview, then when they ran out of visas, they called these people and said, we've run out of green cards and I'm sorry, there's none available for you anymore. So at that point, the person's already submitted all of their evidence to show that they were pursuing this green card. They've submitted their 485. They've submitted, all of that paperwork. So then they need to go get their E3 again because they're not going to get, or whatever visa they were on, because they're not getting this green card anymore. So in that instance, it's great if you can show, yes, I was pursuing the green card. It would have been great. And I did, submit a 485, which does show immigrant intent. But as you see, I have this home abroad, this mortgage, this, so I have significant home ties to show my non-immigrant intent. Also, don't panic if you don't own a property abroad and you're in this situation. We can help you. And, all our clients that have been presented in this situation that didn't own property, we've sorted them out. I'm just saying it is beneficial and it's great. And it's something that's just easy evidence if you have it. And so if you're planning on buying property, the purpose of tonight was just, if you're planning on buying property in Australia and having a mortgage, that there are benefits for your non-immigrant visa applications and with respect to showing that intent to depart and or non-immigrant intent as required by these non-immigrant visa categories. Our details are here, but I'm going to switch over now to stop sharing and go over to Martin.
Thanks, Chantal. Awesome. Okay, cool. So I'll start by giving an Australian mortgage overview, but before that, maybe a quick introduction to our firm. So we're owed on mortgage and tax, so we actually also have a tax arm, but for today, we probably won't cover the majority of the tax questions that come through because it is quite specific to obviously tax, but I can't give tax advice, so I'll probably gloss over some of the easy tax questions, but for the harder ones, definitely recommend you reach out to our tax team. All right, so let's get started. Today's agenda, so I'll go over the Australian lending overview, and I'll give some mortgage tips, why you should use an expat mortgage broker as opposed to maybe your brother or a family friend in Australia, because likely they may get it wrong and you'll waste a couple of months there. Tip number 2 is how to avoid headaches when buying property. Tip number 3 is how to cash out from existing properties if you already have a property in Australia. And then I'll cover a question that I often get asked by people who are overseas: should they buy now or should they buy when they get back? And then finally, some case studies. So the Australian lending overview. So the RBA held cash rate steady at 4.1% in September, and that was held steady for the past 2 or 3 months. And the next rate update will be next Tuesday, the October rate update. And the consensus in the market is that they will also keep rates steady at 4.1%. So it should give homeowners a bit of breathing room. And if the cash rate's at 4.1%, where are mortgage rates? So mortgage rates are currently at around 6.2% for investors. So for those of you who don't know, there is a difference in interest rates between investors and owner-occupiers. Now, owner-occupiers are those who live in the home. And again, you have to show that you're living in the home, driver's license, things like that. But as an expat, when you're living overseas and you're applying for this mortgage, you'll only be allowed to get investor rates until you move back into the property when you move to Australia, or if your significant other moves into the property, you can then claim it as a owner-occupier property. So current rates are about 6.2%, which is almost double what they were 2 years ago when they were 3% and the market was going nuts. Next chart is another question that people often ask me, like, what does this mean for house prices? The textbook answer is when interest rates go up, prices come down. However, the reality is nobody really knows because the market has priced this all in. And if you take a long-term view of the market over the past 30 years, even when interest rates go up, property prices have, even when interest rates have gone up, property prices have continued to climb up. Now, I don't want to say that property prices just go up forever, but this chart seems to imply that even when interest rates go up, the impact of property prices are relatively low. And it probably has something to do with the inflation and holding of real assets and the money printing that goes on in the world these days. So the reality is nobody really knows what's going to happen to property prices. So don't ask me for my predictions. The RBA rates, whether they're at 3% or 5%, it's probably not that significant in the grand scheme of things for property prices. It does mean a lot for your mortgage repayments, but in terms of prices, the correlation is probably not as great as people expect. And then the other thing is probably to think about like whether or not you want to own real assets. If we do have periods of hyperinflation, if we have recessions, how does that impact property prices? These are all things that you want to consider. But unfortunately, I'm not a property agent, so I don't like to give predictions on the price. I'm just here to explain how to get the best mortgage when you're overseas. So tip number one is to use an expat mortgage broker if you do decide to purchase a property and you need to get a mortgage. And the question people ask me is, can I get financing myself? So you can do it yourself. You can actually call the banks and get understanding on their policies, and you might have to call 5 or 10 banks to figure out which one is the best for you. You then have to manage the agent and solicitors yourself, fill in the application forms yourself, collect all the documents, go back and forth with the banks, find witnesses, execute contracts. So you could do everything yourself, but then in the end, you're likely going to get rejected and you're going to pull your own hair out. The alternative is to use a broker like Go to Mortgage, who will do the preliminary assessment for you before submitting, will guide you through the process, will manage all the parties, and we actually do this for free. So mortgage brokers don't actually charge any money, charge any fees. The banks pay us, and we actually just do everything for you free of cost, and you get better rates than if you're going to the bank directly. So for those of you who do want to pull your hair out yourself and do everything yourself, I'll give you some tips. So the first one is which banks will apply Australian tax rates versus local tax rates, because it does impact how much you can borrow, whether you're paying, let's say if you're in Singapore or somewhere where the tax rates are lower, then you probably want to choose a bank that chooses local tax rates. Whereas if you're in the States and you are paying even higher tax, then you probably want to choose a lender that's going to be a bit more lenient. Number two is research which banks will lend 80% versus which banks will only do 70%. So if you don't have enough deposit or you want to borrow more, then you have to figure out which banks will actually lend you more. And then tip number three is research which banks have policies that are suitable for your situation. So for example, some banks won't lend to people overseas unless you're working for a multinational, and they won't let you use your bonuses, or they won't let you refinance after you buy a property. So a classic example is if you go to a bank that doesn't let you refinance and doesn't let you take equity out of your property, you actually have to switch banks in a few years' time. And that just means more paperwork and more efforts. So you really just want to structure it correctly from day one. Tip number two is how to avoid settlement headaches when buying a property. So the answer is get a pre-approval. So if you take away nothing from my presentation today, take away this one thing. It's to get a pre-approval, because that not only confirms how much you can borrow, but it also mitigates against loss of deposit. Because for example, if you put down an offer and you can't actually get the financing, then your deposit actually gets taken away from you. The third one is it gives you negotiating power relative to other buyers. So if you have a pre-approval in place, you can go to the the seller and say, hey, I'm ready to execute now. I've got my financing in place. Let's sign. Versus someone who's like, oh, I'm not sure if I can sign or not because I'm not sure if I can get financing. Please give me a couple of weeks. And that couple of weeks turns into months. And then that seller has probably already sold to someone else for a cheaper price because they just wanted to get the sale done. Pre-approvals are valid for 3 to 6 months, so you can focus on property hunting. The process of getting a mortgage while you're overseas is actually quite hard. So you probably don't want to be juggling looking for a property with your parents if they're in Australia looking for you and doing the mortgage application. You just want to be focused on looking for a property after you've got a pre-approval. They cost nothing, as all the bank fees are only payable if you find a property. So firstly, we charge nothing, but the banks will also charge you nothing until you actually settle on a property. So the whole process is free. The only thing it takes is time. And it does take a while, so we recommend people get started early. So what's the timeline look like? So the first step is you come to our website and you get an online assessment, an online form, and you submit your information, and then we can recommend you a lender based on the information you submitted. Then the next step is you upload documents for us to review, and then we submit an application for you and wait for the lender to get back to us. And finally, the loan is pre-approved, and then you can begin your property search. And then in the final stages, you sign a contract, and then the settlement and execution is handled by your brokers, your agents, and your solicitors. Tip number 3, how to cash out equity from existing properties to use as a down payment. So for those of you who have property, this is a strategy for you to grow your property portfolio. And for those of you who don't have an existing property, this is probably a strategy that you want to be familiar with so that when you do buy, you understand how people can actually turn their property portfolio from 1 property into 2 or 3 properties. And it's the concept of cashing out equity. So it helps you unlock capital gains on your existing property. So if your property is appreciated in price, then you can take out some of the equity from that. And I'll give an example on the next slide. The other pro is that it minimizes the cash contribution from you that's required for the purchase. So a lot of times, if you're buying, let's say, a $1 million property and you have to have a down payment of 20%, that's 200K. So where do you get that 200K from? Part of it will be from your savings, and then the other part can be some of the equity in your existing portfolio or property that's appreciated in value. Another reason to cash out is you can potentially restructure an unfavorable mortgage. So a lot of times after you get a mortgage, you're probably on a very good rate, and we call it the honeymoon rate for the first 2 or 3 years. And after you come off the honeymoon rate, the banks are not incentivized to help you lower your interest rates and reduce their own profit margins. However, as the broker, we've constantly got your best interest at heart, and we have a client concierge team that reviews your mortgage every year for you. So you might want to restructure your mortgage. Potential cashback incentives to cover the switching costs. And the cons, though, are if you borrow more, you obviously have larger repayments and higher interest costs, and you could be potentially over leveraged, etc. So it's not always just pros. You've got to consider the costs as well. So let's use an example. So a client of ours, let's say, purchased a property in 2015. The purchase price was 600K, almost impossible these days, but 600K, and they got a mortgage for 480K, which is 80% of the purchase price. Then in 2022, last year, they did a valuation on the property, and it's now worth 800K. The property value has gone up, and they've paid down 80K of their loan. So the LVR is now only 50%. They've only got 50% of the valuation of the property with a mortgage. So what do? So we can cash out equity of 240K to get the property back up to an 80% mortgage. So 800K, 80% is around 640K, and you're releasing 240K of equity. So you're releasing 240K of cash from your existing property. And what do you do with that 240K? Well, that 240K can now form the deposit you need for purchasing your next property. So the funds required for purchasing your next $1 million purchase, you would only have to put in $10,000 of your own cash, because the other 240K comes from cashing out equity from your first property. So this is a strategy a lot of people use. For those who have gotten into the market and your property is appreciated in value, this is a strategy you can use to take out equity and use to buy a second property if you choose to do so. So now let's move into the question of should I buy now or should I buy back in Australia? I think this is really a personal preference, but from a mortgage side of things, I can tell you why it makes more sense to purchase now if you want to maximize your borrowing. However, don't forget that if you buy a property back in Australia, you're going to have tax consequences. You're going to have to consider the tax ramifications, and best to speak to a tax advisor for that. But I guess the benefits are you can also show your non-immigrant intent status as well. So what should we do? So focus on the questions that matter. So what are the questions that matter? Will I eventually move back to Australia, or do I plan to stay in the States forever? Am I taking advantage of my expat status? So what is the expat status advantage? It's likely that you're on higher US dollar income. So that means you'll be able to borrow more. And then the third question is, do I really have an ability to time the market? So people are like, oh, I'll just wait back to when I get back to Australia, I'll wait for property prices to come down. But what we've found is that it's actually extremely hard to time the market. So you're better off focusing on different aspects of your expat life cycle. So what do I mean by that? So which timeline are you focused on, right? So the housing cycle goes up and down over time. So it's actually quite impossible to try to pick the bottom or pick the top. A lot of people just end up sitting on their hands and not doing too much. But the key is that this red line down here is that the housing and expat cycles evolve mostly independently. And what do I mean by the expat cycle? Well, by expat cycle, I mean that when you're an expat, that's probably when your borrowing power and your purchasing potential is strongest, right? And the reason for that is you're overseas, you're on high compensation, you have strong assets versus your liability, pretty much got no liabilities, maybe no kids, no private schools yet, and you don't have an existing mortgage. And then coupled with a weak Australian dollar, using this example, it might mean you can purchase a property worth 1.5 million to 1.8 million. So that will get you something quite nice, even in Sydney, a house in a suburb you like, or if you are looking at Queensland or Western Australia or South Australia, you should be able to get something quite decent for you to move back in. Now, as time goes on, your borrowing power or your purchasing power actually comes down, right? And the reason for that is because if there's high interest rates or the government or the regulatory bodies deem that there's too much borrowing in the market or housing prices have gone up too much, they start to put in measures to cool the property market, right? And how do they do that? They do that by putting in place measures like debt to income ratio and caps, which means that they won't let you borrow more than 6 times your income. Previously, it was 8 times. At one point, there was no cap. And as the market continues to go up, they put in more measures, right? So it's kind of like a double whammy effect, which as the property prices go up, you continue to get priced out. As you get priced out, the banks actually reduce you less. The bank's actually going to lend you less money. So it actually gets harder and harder over time to get into the market. So your borrowing power gets reduced. And then finally, when you repatriate back to Australia, your borrowing power then becomes probably the 1.2 to 1.4 million, right? So the reason for that is you're going to have a reduced income package. You're going to pay, maybe you'll pay lower taxes, but you're going to have more deductions. You're going to start paying HECS, you're going to have Medicare, you're going to have super, and that really reduces the amount that you can borrow when you move back to Australia relative to when you're an expat. So the final takeaway, I guess, for this point is a lot of people who end up being able to buy their dream property, it's not necessarily because they earn more money or they've figured out a way. It's just they've been able to take advantage of their situation and get the maximum borrowing to buy that dream property. So if you're an overseas expat and you're earning good money and you know your income's going to take a hit when you get back to Australia, if you want that dream property, it means you can get it by borrowing more. Now, whether or not you should borrow more, that's a question that you got to ask yourself. Can you afford the repayments? But Other than that, that's how you maximize your borrowing power. So now I'll probably just finish with one or two case studies before we move into Q&A. So the first case study is like what not to do. So we had a client 2 years ago. They found a dream home and they made an offer. They were assured by the selling agent and the local broker that financing was easy because they've never done an expat deal before and they didn't know how to do it. And they made a bid without financing, but they couldn't secure a mortgage at a big four major bank. They ended up having to renege on their contract and they lost the dream home that they wanted to another buyer, actually at a lower price. So definitely don't sign anything until you have a pre-approval in place. Now, what does a perfect purchase look like? So in January 2022, we helped a client secure a pre-approval. We got them sharp rates and sufficient lending after the assessment. Then they engaged a buyer's agent to begin their search, and then they leveraged on their expertise, someone to help them look for a property while they were overseas, do the inspections and negotiate, and they actually got a 2.5% discount, which more than covers the buyer's agent's fee. However, if you've got people on the ground in Australia or you're very familiar with the area, then maybe you can skip the buyer's agent. And then the settlement, it was handled 3 or 4 months later by the brokers and the buying agent and the solicitors. One more case study with more tangible examples. So this one was a client came to us. You're not going to get 2.89% rates anymore. This was about 1 or 2 years ago. So they got pre-approved for $1.5 million investment property at an expat-friendly bank. They were a family of 4. They secured a rolling path. They wanted to buy before they repatriated. And the reason for that was because they were in Hong Kong and they wanted to leverage on their high income buy before they moved back to Australia. Because after they moved back to Australia, they probably wouldn't have been able to afford this property. So 1 month later, they engaged a buyer's agent, 4-bedroom home near the beach, has a swimming pool, near the selected primary school that they wanted to go to. And then 6 months later, they changed it from an investment property to an owner-occupied property, which actually saved them an interest rate of about 50 basis points. And that goes back to my point before, where when you first get the mortgage, it has to be an investment, and then later you turn it into an owner-occupier property. So to wrap up, 4 key tips. Use an expat mortgage broker if you're based overseas. Get a pre-approval to avoid headaches. Leverage on your expat status and earning power. And then finally, review your existing mortgages for equity release and savings and cashback if you have an existing mortgage. So with that, I'll pass it back to Libby, who will now kick off the Q&A. So thanks, Libby.
Great, thanks so much, Chantal and Martin. There's a lot of information to digest there, so we'll see if we can help pull out some of those key points with the questions that were submitted to us, and also grabbing any out of the chat that might be relevant as well. Martin, I'll start with you since you were the last one speaking. A question from Jeremy: is now a good time to renegotiate your mortgage back in Australia, even if you're an expat?
Yeah, so it's definitely always a good time to look into your mortgage. And I think now, especially more than ever, because interest rates have never gone up so aggressively in history in Australia as compared to the last 1 or 2 years. And like I was mentioning before, a lot of banks, they're not going to tell you whether or not the rate is too expensive. They are very happy to charge you 7-8%, right, when you don't have to pay that. So actually, we had a client come to us maybe even just 1 year ago when interest rates were around 3 to 4%. This client was paying 6.8%, so almost double what they should have been paying. And the banks don't incentivize to tell you that you're overpaying. So when they came to us, we told them, hey, you're overpaying, let's refinance. And we actually managed to get them down to a 3 to 4% interest rate. So yes, the answer is yes, definitely come speak to us and we should be able to help you negotiate on your rate.
Yeah, amazing. That's a huge difference. Chantal, over to you quickly. When will E3 visas be stamped in the USA without traveling to a US consulate?
Oh, that's a good one. So actually, there might be some confusion with that. So there was an update saying that L's and H's they're going to implement stamping of L's and H's in the US, where you don't have to go to a consulate abroad and you can do it in your passport. They have not said that they'll do that for E3s yet at all. But even so, though they said it for H's and L's, even H's and L's haven't actually started implementing that yet. And it's been 6 months since they said that they were going to start doing that. So I don't know that we're going to see it for E3s anytime soon.
Okay, so we still have to go on those mandatory vacations to excellent locations.
I know, right? It's tough. It's tough having to go to Barbados or Bahamas, right? Paris, London.
Yeah. It sounds awful. Although it is, timing is always difficult. But Martin, I've got a question here from Lauren. We're interested in which banks, Australian or US, lend to Aussie US residents for tax purposes wanting to purchase an Australian home.
Yeah, so I probably can't speak to the US banks, although there are cases where overseas banks will lend to Australians to buy property in Australia. At least in Hong Kong and Singapore, they do allow for that, probably because of how close it is geographically. However, in the US, I think you'd probably struggle to find US banks lending to Australian properties. However, what I would say is the Australian banks, most of them lend to expats overseas. You just have to find the right one. And usually I recommend matching the liability with the asset in the same jurisdiction so that you don't have so much foreign currency exposure as well.
Okay, great. There was a question in the chat on the banks topic. How can we shop around with different banks for the best rate without having hard inquiry on credit history?
Yeah, so the dynamics of credit inquiries in the US and in Australia are a little bit different. So in Australia, it's not so mechanical where if you apply for a mortgage, it immediately hits your credit report and then it reduces your credit score. So in Australia, the banks actually are, I want to say, a lot more sensible in that they understand that, hey, if you're applying for a mortgage, you're going to shop around. And if you're going to shop around, there's going to be multiple marks on your credit report. But as long as you can explain that and say, hey, I was just shopping around, I want to see which one gave me the best rate, even if you had 2 or 3 mortgage inquiries, then they won't then it doesn't negatively impact your credit score. So as long as the story makes sense, the banks in Australia are a lot more reasonable. I guess in the US, because so many people take on credit cards and mortgages, and the US is a much more developed and sophisticated market, they don't have the resources to make a more qualitative assessment. So it's just all computer generated. You make an inquiry, hits your credit score, hits your inquiry, hits your credit score. But in Australia, it's a lot more reasonable. So it actually doesn't matter too much.
Well, that's really helpful to know. Chantel, just heading back to the home ties question. Question here, is it more important to have evidence of home ties for people who are applying for an E3 for the first time or only for people who are renewing their E3?
I think it's equally important. I mean, look, for the first time, probably less important for the first time, right? Because you don't have a history of being here already. It's your first time coming to the US. But certainly having home ties is great. But for the renewals, I guess it's more important because you already have a history, especially you've been here 8 years on 4 E3s. That's when the home ties evidence does become a little bit more relevant.
Could you, I know you touched on this earlier, but just there were a couple of questions coming through in the chat as well. Maybe you lived at home with your parents when you were in Australia, so you might have that address, your parents' address. What other things would be helpful to prove home ties? Superannuation accounts or what else?
Yes, there was a question actually from Lee where she said, or he said, does superannuation, bank accounts and driver's license count? And those do count. Those are awesome points of evidence. And actually, I had all that listed in the chart. I just didn't want to take up too much time. So what I'll do is I'll provide those slides so people can see the other forms of evidence. There was one more question in the chat that I really wanted to answer to. Can I go ahead and answer that? It was from Smash, and I thought it was an excellent question, Smash, and it's a good reminder. I know when we've done these DB lottery webinars in the past, I've covered this, but tonight I didn't touch on it, and which was, Smash says that to apply for the Green Card Lottery as an Australian, a reminder that you do have to be born in Australia or in a qualifying country. So to apply for the Green Card Lottery, your country of nationality depends on where you were born, not just that you're an Australian citizen. So Samesh was born in India, and Indian nationals can't apply. So that means he would not be able to enter the green card lottery. So Mesh, there are some exceptions to that. So for example, you can do a thing called cross chargeability. So if your spouse, if you're married to someone who was born in another country, you can claim their country of birth as your nationality. So say you're born in India, but your spouse was born in Australia, you can actually apply through this cross chargeability. So just know that there are options. If you have an Australian passport, but you born somewhere that doesn't qualify, maybe ask an immigration lawyer to see if they can pinpoint something that allows you to still apply.
That's great. Thank you. Martin, what items can be claimed from an investment property? Is it the same in Australia, in brackets, negative gearing?
Yeah, so actually what you can claim on your investment property is exactly the same, regardless of where you're living. So the standard stuff in Australia, like property management expenses, depreciation, and anything associated with an investment property. You used to even be able to claim your flights back to Australia and say, hey, this is actually a trip to buy an investment property, but I think they got rid of that because too many people were abusing it. I actually want to answer one of these questions here from Matthew Lee Robinson. So one of the questions here was, when they're visiting Australia in 2022, Commonwealth Bank said they wouldn't accept overseas income. Now, that's just not true. So why sometimes banks give you the wrong advice is because the bankers themselves either A, don't understand the policies, or B, they don't want to deal with you because it's too hard, right? Like you're in the US, for them to do your application, it just requires too much paperwork. They're going to have to talk to you back and forth. You're in US time zones. They're in Australia. They can either serve you or they can serve the next guy that walks into the branch, right? So it's actually just not true that they won't accept overseas income. And that's why we've been able to build a business around this, because we know and we challenge the banks. When the banks come back to us and say, oh, you can't do this, we're like, no, this says in your policy guide, this is exactly what you can do. Please follow your own policies. And that's actually why we've been able to do so many successful cases, because we know the foreign income deal is actually better than the banks themselves, certain individuals in the banks themselves. So what I will say is maybe CBA wasn't the right bank for you to begin with. So yeah, come speak to us and we should definitely be able to sort you out. Yeah,
right. It's a bit like when you move to the US and you're trying to set up a bank account and you'll go into one branch and they'll tell you, no, you can't have one here as an Australian. And then you go to a different person in the same place and they'll say, yeah, sure, we'll set you up right away. So finding the right person is just as crucial as the right bank. Chantel, what percentage of people typically get denied under the 214B section?
So we actually, we don't see too many people get denied under it. However, we have, the good thing to know is that if you do get denied under 214B, where we've typically seen it is someone has either, sometimes they'll get denied for not being able to show that they qualify for the visa. Maybe they didn't have the right paperwork. Maybe they didn't put together their paperwork very well, or they were unable to show home ties. But for B's, F's and J's, often it can be a home ties issue. For the other categories, often it's also that they weren't able to establish that they qualify for the visa. The good thing about a 214B denial is that you can apply again and get approved. So we have had instances where we've seen 214B denials come into our office. We've redone their paperwork, enhanced either the aspect of showing that they do qualify for the visa that they're applying for, because it's a two-prong, right? 214B is two prongs, showing you qualify for the visa and also the home ties, and then have gotten it approved. So if anyone does get denied under 214B, know that, you know, I would contact an immigration attorney, and an immigration attorney hopefully should be able to get that turnaround for you.
Excellent. Thank you. Martin, another one that came through earlier. I'm a potential first-time buyer in NYC and need to sell a property in Australia to do this. What do I need to know?
So could you repeat that question?
Yeah, no problem. Came through from Sandra. I'm a potential first-time buyer in New York City and need to sell a property in Australia to do this. What do I need to know?
Okay, so I think this probably covers or touches on tax a bit more, but I'll try to answer it. But obviously don't rely on what I say. Speak to one of our tax advisors. So if you're going to buy a property in the US and you need to sell a property in Australia, what that means is if that property in Australia has gone up in price, you will then be subject to capital gains tax. And when you're selling properties while you're a non-tax resident, what that means is every dollar that you make from capital gains or even income in Australia, you have to pay 30% taxes on that dollar of capital gains. So what people usually do is like they try not to sell property while they're overseas until they go back to Australia, and they can get tax-free thresholds and tax benefits from selling it when you're in Australia. So that's probably something you should consider. If you're selling a property while you're overseas, you probably have to pay a bit more tax.
Excellent, thank you. I guess that's kind of, we're running out of time, but Chantal, Martin, any last thoughts or last answers to things you may have seen pop up in the chat before we wrap up?
I might like to, I'm just thinking about that last question you asked me, and I think some people the question might be, like, I think there was a period a couple of years ago where I would get a lot of calls from people on an E3 saying, oh, it's my fourth E3, I think I'm going to get denied. I've heard that people are getting denied for lack of home ties or not having a home abroad or not, immigrant intent. And I just wanted to say, so maybe that percentage question might have been related to that. We've never seen a visa be denied for immigrant intent for an E3 in our office. We've heard of it through other, where these people were all panicked and called and said, oh, my friend said that they got denied for immigrant intent. I would say typically in a situation like that, as long as you're very prepared for your E3 visa, interview, you shouldn't be getting denied under that category.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Martin, any last thoughts or comments?
I still see a bunch of questions in the chat, but yeah, I think we'll have to wrap up. So feel free to jump onto our website and just submit an inquiry, and we'll have one of our brokers reach out to you and answer your questions. But to summarize, I think if you're looking to buy a property in Australia, definitely get a pre-approval first. If you have an existing property, definitely look to refinance and reduce some of those rates. Yeah, that's all from me. So yeah, thank you very much, Libby.
Excellent. Just so everybody watching tonight knows, we will send out an email to you all tomorrow, which will include the slides from tonight, as well as ways to get in touch with both Commissioner Markel and Odin Mortgage. So thank you for joining us. Chantal and Martin, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. You're both so knowledgeable, and we're so lucky to get this advice from you both. If you enjoyed tonight, let us know. If there's certain topics you want us to cover in the future, make sure you reach out. We're always willing to take on that feedback and tie that into our future programming. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks, Chantal. Thanks, Martin.
Bye, Libby.